The wagon creaked under its burden as the horses strained forward through the thick, clinging mud. Inside, a young boy no more than 7 years old clutched the wooden frame, his knuckles white with fear as the vehicle tilted precariously to one side. Rain had pounded the dirt road all night, turning the morning journey into a treacherous ordeal. "Mama!" the boy cried, his voice thin with panic as one of the horses reared, sensing the wagon's dangerous angle. The woman driving, the boy's mother, tugged desperately at the reins, but the wagon was sinking deeper, its wheel caught in a hidden rut. The horses whinnied in distress, their muscles trembling with the effort to pull free. And then she appeared. Grace Watson emerged from the tree line like a figure from a tall tale, her silhouette unmistakable, even in the misty morning light. Standing nearly 6 feet 2 inches tall with shoulders broader than many of the men in Oak Haven, she moved with surprising fluidity toward the stranded wagon. "Easy there," Grace called to the horses, her voice low and melodious. She approached them slowly, one hand extended in a calming gesture. The animals quieted almost instantly, as if recognizing a natural authority. The boy's mother stared with undisguised shock as Grace placed her hands against the side of the wagon. "Ma'am, if you'll keep the horses steady, I'll lift on my count," Grace instructed, positioning herself at the sunken wheel. "1, 2, 3. With a deep breath, Grace braced her legs and pushed upward. Muscles strained beneath her simple cotton dress as the wagon groaned, then slowly began to rise. Mud sucked at the wheel as it emerged from the rut. With one final heave, Grace freed the vehicle and guided it onto firmer ground. The woman blinked in disbelief. "I've never... How did you..." "Oh," Grace smiled gently, wiping her hands on her apron. "The good Lord gave me unusual gifts," she said simply. "Best put them to use when needed." The boy peered over the side of the wagon, his fear replaced by wonder. "Are you one of those circus strong women, miss?" "Tommy," his mother scolded, but Grace just laughed. "No, just a farmer's daughter," she replied, patting the horse's flanks reassuringly. "These beauties did the hardest work. They just needed a little help." As the grateful woman thanked her and continued on her journey, Grace turned back toward the town of Oak Haven. She knew what awaited her there, the whispers, the sideways glances. She had lived with them all her 23 years. Unnatural, they called her when they thought she couldn't hear. A woman shouldn't have such strength, they'd say, shaking their heads. Yet the same townsfolk who whispered behind their hands didn't hesitate to call on Grace when fence posts needed setting or barrels needed moving. Her unusual physical gifts were welcome when convenient, scorned when not. She reached the outskirts of town just as the church bell struck 9. Mist still clung to the valley, shrouding the modest wooden buildings in a soft haze. Oak Haven wasn't much: a general store, a small church, a saloon, and a scattering of homes and businesses strung along the main street, but it was the only home Grace had ever known. Outside the church stood Mr. Franklin, the town's minister, sweeping the steps clear of debris from the previous night's storm. He nodded at Grace with genuine warmth. "Blessed morning to you, Miss Watson," he called. "Saw you helping the Parkers. The Lord works through you, whether folks understand that or not." Grace smiled gratefully. "Thank you, Reverend. Sometimes I wonder myself. The good book tells us that God distributes different gifts to each person," Franklin said, leaning on his broom. "The Apostle Paul spoke of many gifts, but the same Spirit. You remember that when the gossips start up." Grace nodded, drawing comfort from the familiar words. Though she rarely voiced it aloud, she often wondered why God had made her so different. Not just her height and strength, but the way her mind worked. Quick to understand, eager to learn, drawn to books most women never touched. Her mother had understood. Margaret Watson had nurtured Grace's curious mind, teaching her to read not just the Bible, but also the few medical books she'd acquired from a traveling doctor. "Your size is a blessing, not a curse," she'd insist, when Grace would come home crying after other children's taunts. "Some vessels are made larger because they have more to carry." But Margaret was gone now, taken by fever 2 winters past, along with Grace's father, Henry. The memory of their loss still ached like a physical wound. Grace continued down the dusty main street toward the general store where she worked 3 days a week. The shopkeeper's wife, Mrs. Holloway, was one of the few people in town who treated Grace with genuine kindness, appreciating her ability to stock high shelves and move heavy inventory with ease. "Morning, Grace," the older woman called as she entered. "Shipment came in yesterday. Would you mind bringing up the flour sacks from the cellar? My arthritis is giving me fits today." "Of course, Mrs. Holloway," Grace replied, heading toward the trap door behind the counter. As she descended into the cool, dim cellar, Grace could hear the bell above the door chime, followed by the unmistakable whispers that seemed to follow her everywhere. "Lord Almighty, I don't know how the Holloways can employ that woman," a female voice muttered. "It ain't natural for a female to be built like that." "She's a good worker," Mrs. Holloway defended, gentle as a lamb despite her size. "Still, she makes me uncomfortable. My Eliza says she can lift more than any man in town. Proper women just aren't meant to be that way." Grace closed her eyes briefly, letting the familiar hurt wash over her. Then, with practiced dignity, she hoisted 3 heavy flour sacks onto her shoulder and climbed back up the stairs. The gossiping woman, Mrs. Peterson, wife of the local banker, had the grace to look embarrassed when Grace emerged, but quickly masked it with a haughty expression. "Morning, Mrs. Peterson," Grace said politely, setting the flour down with careful control. "Lovely day after the storm, isn't it?" The woman mumbled something non-committal and turned her attention to the ribbons displayed on the counter. By midday, Grace had finished her work at the store and headed home to the small farm where she now lived with her Uncle Herbert and his wife Agatha. It wasn't truly home anymore, not since her parents had died and the farm had passed to her father's brother. Herbert had inherited not just the land, but the responsibility for his brother's only child as well. The farmhouse came into view as she crested the small hill, its weathered wood and sagging porch a stark contrast to the neatly kept property it had been under her father's care. The drought had hit the Watson farm hard this year, as it had all of Oak Haven. Fields that should have been verdant with wheat lay brown and withered, the earth cracked like aged leather. As Grace approached, she saw Uncle Herbert sitting on the porch steps, his face drawn with worry as he studied a wrinkled paper in his hands. Aunt Agatha stood nearby, her thin lips pressed into a hard line. "There you are, finally," Agatha said by way of greeting. "We've important matters to discuss." Grace nodded, recognizing the tension in the air. "What's happened?" Herbert looked up, his eyes unable to meet hers. "The bank's calling in our loan. Peterson says we've 3 weeks to pay in full or they'll take the farm." "But that's impossible," Grace protested. "The drought's affected everyone. He can't expect—" "He can and he does," Agatha interrupted. "We're 2 payments behind, and with the harvest looking this poor," she gestured to the barren fields. Herbert rose slowly, folding the paper with trembling hands. We've been considering our options, Grace." Something in his voice sent a chill through her. "What options?" Agatha answered instead. "The Thompsons over in Riverton got through last year's drought by sending their eldest to work for the mill owner. Good arrangement for all concerned." "The Thompsons' eldest is a son," Grace pointed out. "And you're stronger than any son," Agatha countered. "There's talk of laborers needed for the railroad. Or, Grace prompted, suddenly wary. Herbert cleared his throat. "There's to be an indenture auction in town tomorrow. 7 years of service in exchange for immediate payment to the family." The words hung in the air like a physical presence. Grace felt as if the ground had shifted beneath her. "You want to sell me?" she whispered. "Not sell," Herbert insisted, his face flushing with shame. "Indenture. It's perfectly legal, and it's only for 7 years. You'd have a roof over your head, meals provided, and we'd have enough to pay the bank and get through until next harvest," Agatha added with cold practicality. "You eat more than both of us combined, Grace. In times like these, harsh decisions must be made." Grace stood frozen, her mind struggling to comprehend what was happening. The aunt and uncle who had taken her in, however reluctantly, after her parents' death now saw her as a commodity to be traded away. "I could work more," she offered desperately. "Take on jobs for other farms. Use my strength." "We've thought it all through," Herbert interrupted, still unable to meet her eyes. "This is the only way to save the farm. Your parents would understand. They'd want their home preserved." Grace felt a surge of anger at the manipulation. "My parents would never sell their child to save a piece of land." You're hardly a child anymore, Agatha sniffed, and you're not being reasonable. What future do you have here anyway? No man will court you, built as you are. At least this way you'd have purpose. The words stung because they carried the sharp edge of truth. Grace had long ago accepted that marriage was unlikely for her. Few men in Oak Haven could look past her unusual stature to see the woman beneath. That night, Grace lay awake in the small attic room that had been hers since childhood, watching shadows from the swaying trees outside dance across the ceiling. A Bible sat open on her lap, her mother's Bible, with its carefully preserved pressed flower bookmarks in margin notes in a delicate hand. She turned to Proverbs, seeking wisdom. Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he shall direct your paths. Grace traced her finger over the words, remembering her mother reading them aloud. She thought about resistance, about running away. But where would she go? With what money? And despite everything, could she truly abandon the only home she'd ever known? By dawn, resignation had settled over her like a heavy blanket. If this was God's path for her, she would walk it with the same quiet dignity her mother had always shown in hardship. The town square had been transformed by mid-morning. A wooden platform stood in its center, the rough planks still smelling of fresh-cut pine. A small crowd had gathered, drawn by the novelty of an indenture auction, a practice that had grown uncommon in recent years, but resurged during hard times. William Porter, the auctioneer, was a wiry man with an overloud voice that compensated for his unimposing stature. He moved about the platform with theatrical flourishes, warming up the growing audience with jokes and commentary. Grace stood off to the side, trying to make herself inconspicuous, an impossible task given her height. She wore her best dress, a simple blue cotton garment that her mother had let out 3 times to accommodate her growth. The hem hung slightly too high above her ankles, revealing worn boots that had belonged to her father. Herbert and Agatha waited nearby, not speaking to her or each other. The weight of their decision had settled heavily on Herbert's shoulders, stooping them further than age had already done. Agatha, however, remained rigid and determined, her eyes fixed on the auctioneer with grim resolution. "Quite a sight, ain't she?" The voice came from behind Grace, deliberately loud enough for her to hear. She didn't need to turn to know it belonged to Marcus Riley, owner of the saloon and boarding house at the edge of town, a business rumored to offer more than just drinks and lodging to lonely men passing through. "Strong as an ox from what I hear," another voice joined in. Amos Crawford, whose timber mill north of town was known for working men until they dropped. "Could be useful." Grace closed her eyes briefly, steadying herself against the objectifying assessment. She had heard worse, she reminded herself. She would endure this too. "Ladies and gentlemen of Oak Haven," Porter called out, commanding attention. "Today we have a most unusual opportunity for those seeking reliable labor." Grace felt Herbert's hand on her elbow, guiding her forward. The touch was gentle but insistent, and she allowed herself to be led to the steps of the platform. Each footfall on the wooden stairs echoed with finality. "Miss Grace Watson," Porter announced, gesturing grandly as if presenting a curiosity. 23 years of age, in excellent health, and possessed of remarkable strength. Can plow a field from sunrise to sunset, milk 20 cows before breakfast, and lift what would take 2 grown men to move. Murmurs rippled through the crowd as Grace stood with her chin held high, eyes fixed on the distant mountains. She refused to see the pity or curiosity in the townspeople's faces. "A rare opportunity indeed," Porter continued. 7 years of dedicated service to the highest bidder. Think of the work that could be accomplished with such help. Shall we start the bidding at 1 bag of quality grain?" "1 bag," called out Amos Crawford, raising his hand. "1 bag and a side of bacon," countered Riley, his gaze traveling the length of Grace's tall frame in a way that made her skin crawl. 1.5 bags, Crawford returned. Porter nodded enthusiastically. 1.5 bags of grain. A bargain, gentlemen, for 7 years of such labor. Do I hear 2? 2 bags, said Riley, smirking. The bidding continued, the 2 men locked in a contest that had little to do with Grace's worth as a worker and everything to do with their own egos. Grace stood motionless through it all, her expression carefully blank even as her heart pounded with humiliation and dread. The thought of 7 years with either man filled her with quiet terror. 2 bags and a hunting rifle, Crawford called. 3 bags and a barrel of whiskey, Riley countered. Porter was nearly dancing with excitement at the escalating offers. 3 bags and whiskey, going once. 5 bags of grain. The new voice cut through the commotion like a blade. Deep and steady, it carried an authority that immediately silenced the crowd. People turned, parting to reveal a tall man standing at the back of the gathering. He moved forward with measured steps, and Grace found herself studying him intently. Though he matched her in height, there was nothing ungainly in his bearing. His face was weathered by sun and wind, framed by dark hair threaded with silver at the temples. But it was his eyes that captured her attention. Storm gray and direct, meeting her gaze without flinching or morbid fascination. "And who might you be, sir?" Porter asked, clearly pleased by this new development. "Joseph Mercer," the man replied, his focus never leaving Grace. "I own a ranch 30 miles west." He climbed the steps of the platform with deliberate movements, and Grace noticed a slight stiffness in his gait, as though an old injury troubled him. He stopped directly before her, close enough that she could see the fine lines around his eyes. Lines carved by sun and laughter, and perhaps sorrow too. "What's your name?" he asked quietly, addressing her directly rather than the auctioneer. Startled by being spoken to as a person rather than an object, Grace found her voice. "Grace Watson." "Grace," he repeated thoughtfully. "Are you Henry and Margaret Watson's daughter?" The unexpected mention of her parents sent a jolt through her. "Yes," she managed. "Did you know them?" A complex emotion passed over Joseph's face, something like reverence mixed with old grief. "Your father saved my life once," he said simply. "A debt I was never able to repay." He turned to Porter. "What's she being sold for?" Not the bid, the actual reason. Porter looked uncomfortable at the directness of the question. "Well, that is, 1 bag of grain," Grace answered for him, her voice clear and steady despite the humiliation burning in her chest. "To save the family farm from foreclosure." Joseph's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a leather pouch that clinked heavily with coins. "That's 6 months' wages," he stated, tossing it to Porter. "More than enough to cover any debt and then some." He turned back to Grace. "I'm not buying you like livestock, Miss Watson. I need help at my ranch, and I pay fair wages. If you come with me, it's because you choose to. And if you ever choose to leave, I'll take you wherever you want to go and provide enough for a fresh start." Grace stared at him, searching for the trap in his words. Such generosity couldn't be real, not in a world that had taught her to expect so little kindness. "Why?" she asked bluntly. "Why me?" Joseph's expression softened slightly. "Because everyone here sees you as too much, too tall, too strong, too different. I see someone who might be exactly what my failing ranch needs." He paused. "I've been trying to run it alone since my wife died 5 years ago. It's breaking me. I need someone strong enough to handle the work, someone who won't give up when things get hard." The words struck Grace with unexpected force. No one had ever suggested that her differences might be valuable, that she might be needed precisely because of who she was. "What about the 7 years?" she asked cautiously. "There are no 7 years," Joseph replied firmly. "You work for me, I pay you fair wages, $30 a month plus room and board. The choice is always yours." He extended his hand to her, a gesture of equals making a contract, not a master claiming property. Grace looked at the weathered palm, then back at his face. He was looking at her strength as an asset, not a flaw. Her size as valuable, not shameful. With a clarity that felt almost like divine guidance, Grace placed her hand in his. "I'll work for you, Mr. Mercer," she said, her voice stronger than it had been all day. "For fair wages and the right to leave if I choose." "Deal," Joseph replied, the ghost of a smile touching his lips. He turned to Porter. "We're done here." The auctioneer sputtered in confusion, clearly uncertain about this unorthodox conclusion to his event. Riley and Crawford looked equally displeased, muttering to each other in dark tones. Joseph ignored them all, offering his arm to Grace as they descended the platform steps. As they passed Herbert and Agatha, he pressed the leather pouch into Herbert's hands. For the farm, he said simply, and for raising her well enough that she grew into someone who would sacrifice herself for family. The words contained no judgment, yet Herbert's face flushed with shame nonetheless. Take care of her, was all he managed to say. Grace felt a surprising ache as she looked at her uncle, this man who had failed her yet still cared in his flawed way. I'll be all right, she told him gently. Tell Aunt Agatha I forgive you both. As they walked away from the town square, Grace felt the weight of stares on her back, but found she no longer cared. For the first time in years, she was walking towards something, not simply enduring what life had handed her. I have a wagon at the livery stable, Joseph said. It's a 4-hour journey to the ranch. There's bread and cheese packed for the trip. Grace nodded, suddenly struck by the enormity of what she was doing, leaving the only home she'd ever known with a man she'd just met. As if reading her thoughts, Joseph added, I knew your father during the war. We served in the same regiment. He pulled me from a battlefield when everyone else had given up. Said he couldn't leave a man behind, not while there was breath in his body. That sounds like him, Grace said softly, the unexpected connection to her father warming her heart. He never spoke much about the war. Most of us don't, Joseph replied simply. Some memories are best left buried. They reached the livery stable where a sturdy wagon waited, hitched to 2 healthy-looking draft horses. Joseph helped Grace up to the seat with a courtesy that surprised her. Most men assumed she needed no assistance with anything physical. As they pulled away from Oak Haven, Grace allowed herself one look back at the town that had shaped her, constrained her, and ultimately cast her out. The church steeple rose above the other buildings, its white paint gleaming in the midday sun. Somewhere in the small cemetery behind it lay her parents, their graves marked with simple wooden crosses. Goodbye, she whispered, too softly for Joseph to hear. The wagon rumbled forward, wheels cutting tracks in the dusty road as they headed west toward a future Grace couldn't yet imagine. She sat tall beside Joseph Mercer, her hands folded in her lap, the small Bible tucked safely in her pocket, a tangible connection to the mother who had taught her to find strength in faith and dignity in herself. For the first time in her 23 years, Grace Watson felt the stirring of something that might have been hope. The landscape changed gradually as they traveled westward, the flat farmland giving way to rolling hills dotted with oak and pine. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the trail, and a cool breeze carried the promise of approaching evening. They rode in companionable silence for most of the journey, Joseph occasionally pointing out landmarks or sharing brief observations about the territory. Grace appreciated his lack of forced conversation. It gave her time to process the dramatic turn her life had taken in a single day. Over that ridge is the start of my property, Joseph said, as they crested a small hill. About 500 acres, though only about 100 are workable for crops. The rest is good grazing land for cattle. Grace nodded, taking in the expanse before them. It's beautiful country. It is, Joseph agreed, a note of pride entering his voice. My wife Abigail and I bought it 12 years ago when land out here was still cheap. Had dreams of building something that would last generations. The mention of his wife brought a flicker of sadness to his features, quickly masked. Grace noticed but didn't press. She understood grief in its private nature all too well. The wagon followed a winding path down into a shallow valley where a creek cut through the land, its surface glittering in the late afternoon light. Nestled alongside it sat a substantial 2-story house of hewn logs, a large barn, and several smaller outbuildings. Cattle grazed in a distant pasture, and a small orchard of fruit trees stood to one side of the house. But Grace's trained eye also noticed the signs of neglect, fence posts leaning at odd angles, shingles missing from the barn roof, weeds encroaching on what must have once been a kitchen garden. The property had good bones, as her father would have said, but it was clearly struggling under the care of just one person. It's not much to look at right now, Joseph admitted as they approached. Been fighting a losing battle trying to keep up with it all. It has potential, Grace said honestly. Nothing that can't be fixed with hard work. Joseph glanced at her, appreciation evident in his expression. That's the first time in a long while I've heard someone see it that way, instead of just noting everything that's wrong. They pulled up to the house and Joseph set the brake on the wagon. Up close, Grace could see that despite its weathered exterior, the home had been built with care and craftsmanship. Wide covered porches wrapped around two sides, and large windows suggested bright, airy rooms within. Joseph helped Grace down from the wagon, then began unhitching the horses. I'll show you to your room first, then get these two settled in the stable. He led her up the porch steps and opened the heavy wooden front door. Inside, the house was simple but spacious, with a large main room that served as both kitchen and living area. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, and sturdy handmade furniture was arranged with practical efficiency. It was clean but Spartan, bearing the unmistakable marks of a home maintained by someone focused on necessity rather than comfort. This way, Joseph said, leading her down a short hallway to a door at the rear of the house. I thought you might prefer this room. It gets the morning sun. He opened the door to reveal a modest but pleasant bedroom. A bed with a hand-stitched quilt stood against one wall, alongside a chest of drawers in a small writing desk beneath a window that overlooked the creek. A washstand with a ceramic basin and pitcher completed the furnishings. The door has a lock, Joseph added, pointing to a solid iron bolt on the inside of the door. I want you to feel secure here. This is your private space. Grace was touched by the consideration behind this detail. Thank you, she said simply. I'll bring your bag in from the wagon, Joseph said. Take some time to settle in. Kitchen's stocked, so help yourself if you're hungry. We can talk more over supper. After he left, Grace sat on the edge of the bed, running her hand over the soft quilt. The events of the day felt almost dreamlike in their intensity. This morning she had awakened in her childhood home, expecting another day of routine and quiet endurance. Now she sat in a stranger's house, miles from everything familiar, embarking on an entirely new life. She moved to the window, gazing out at the creek and the distant hills beyond. The beauty of the place touched something deep within her, a longing for belonging she had carried since childhood. Guide my steps, Lord, she whispered, her mother's favorite prayer in times of uncertainty. When she emerged later, Grace found Joseph in the kitchen, preparing a simple meal of beans, cornbread, and coffee. He worked with the efficient movements of someone accustomed to cooking for himself, though there was a certain awkwardness to his actions as well. Can I help? Grace offered. Joseph glanced up, seeming almost relieved. If you wouldn't mind setting the table, plates are in that cupboard. They worked together in easy silence, moving around each other in the kitchen space with natural coordination. When they sat down to eat, Joseph bowed his head briefly in silent grace before serving the food. Tomorrow I can show you around the property, he said as they ate, give you a better sense of what needs doing most urgently. Grace nodded. I noticed the north fence line looks ready to collapse, and the barn roof has seen better days. Joseph raised an eyebrow, impressed by her observant nature. You've got a good eye. Those are indeed at the top of the list, along with preparing for winter. It comes early in these hills. My father always said a farm is only as good as its fences and its roof, Grace offered. Wise man, Joseph agreed. He hesitated, then added, I was sorry to hear about his passing. Both your parents. Henry was a good man. Thank you, Grace said quietly. It's been 2 years, but I still miss them every day. Joseph nodded in understanding. That kind of absence never really goes away. You just learn to carry it differently as time passes. Something in his tone told Grace he spoke from deep personal experience, and she wondered again about the wife he had mentioned. But it wasn't her place to ask, at least not yet. Trust would need to build between them naturally. As they finished the meal, Joseph cleared his throat. There's something else we should discuss, he said, his tone turning businesslike. I mentioned fair wages, $30 a month, plus room and board. That's what I'd pay any ranch hand, though most wouldn't get a room in the main house. $30 was more money than Grace had ever earned at the general store, where Mrs. Holloway had only been able to offer $7 a month for part-time work. That's very generous, she said sincerely. It's fair, Joseph corrected firmly. There's a difference. Your work has value, and I won't exploit that. The direct acknowledgement of her worth, something Grace had rarely experienced, left her momentarily speechless. I should warn you, Joseph continued, seeming almost apologetic. The work here is hard and constant. The seasons don't wait, and neither do the cattle. Some days will test even your strength. I'm not afraid of hard work, Mr. Mercer, Grace assured him. Joseph, he said, if we're to work together as equals, best use my given name. Joseph, she repeated, the informality feeling strange but not unwelcome. And you'll call me Grace. He nodded, the faintest smile touching his lips. Grace it is, then. As darkness fell outside, Joseph lit an oil lamp that cast a warm glow around the kitchen. For the first time, Grace noticed a small framed photograph on a shelf, a woman with a gentle face and kind eyes seated beside a much younger Joseph. His wife, she presumed, though she didn't ask. I rise at dawn, Joseph said as he stood to clear the dishes, but take tomorrow morning to rest if you need it. You've had quite a day. I'll be up at dawn as well, Grace replied. I've never been one for idle hands. Joseph nodded, seeming pleased but not surprised by her answer. Then we'll begin at first light. That night, in the unfamiliar room with its comfortable bed and lock on the door, Grace lay awake listening to the sounds of her new home. The gentle rushing of the creek outside her window, the occasional lowing of cattle in the distance, the creaking of the house as it settled. So much had changed in a single day. She had walked into the town square as property to be sold and walked out as a person with choices. The strangeness of it still left her breathless when she considered it too closely. As she finally drifted toward sleep, Grace's last conscious thought was a prayer of gratitude. Whatever lay ahead on this new path, at least she would walk it on her own terms, her dignity intact. Dawn painted the eastern sky in shades of pink and gold as Grace rose the next morning. She dressed quickly in her work clothes, a simple brown skirt and white blouse, sturdy and practical, if somewhat worn. Her single concession to vanity was to brush her dark hair until it shone before plaiting it into a neat braid. When she emerged from her room, she found Joseph already in the kitchen, a pot of coffee brewing on the stove. He looked up as she entered, nodding in approval at her promptness. Morning, he greeted. Coffee? Please, she answered, accepting the steaming mug he offered. The rich aroma filled her senses, a small luxury she had rarely enjoyed at her uncle's farm, where Agatha considered coffee too expensive for everyday consumption. They shared a simple breakfast of oatmeal and dried apples, then headed outside to begin the day's work. The morning air was crisp with the first hints of autumn, dew glistening on the grass as they walked toward the barn. Thought we'd start with the fence line today, Joseph said. I've cut replacement posts, but they need to be set. Inside the barn, he showed her where the tools were kept and the system he used for organizing them. Grace appreciated the methodical approach. It reminded her of her father's careful ways. Joseph loaded several heavy wooden posts onto a small wagon, the muscles in his arms straining visibly with the effort. Grace stepped forward without hesitation, lifting 2 posts at once with practiced ease. Let me help, she said simply. Joseph paused, watching as she balanced the heavy timbers on her shoulder. His expression held no judgment, only a flicker of what might have been relief. Thank you, he said, his tone matter-of-fact. They're about 60 pounds each. No sense straining my back if I don't have to. His practical acceptance of her strength, treating it as a useful tool rather than an oddity, warmed Grace unexpectedly. She loaded 2 more posts while Joseph gathered the necessary tools, a post-hole digger, spades, and a heavy iron tamping rod. They worked through the morning replacing rotted fence posts along the creek boundary. Joseph dug the holes while Grace held the posts straight, then tamped the earth firmly around them. They developed a rhythm quickly, working together as if they'd done so for years rather than hours. By midday, they had replaced a dozen posts, and Grace could feel the pleasant ache of honest labor in her muscles. They paused in the shade of a large cottonwood tree by the creek to eat the simple lunch they'd packed: bread, cheese, and apples. You're stronger than any man I've worked with, Joseph remarked as he took a drink from his canteen. His tone was conversational, free from the usual discomfort that accompanied such observations. Grace tensed slightly, waiting for the inevitable suggestion that her strength was unseemly for a woman. Including myself, Joseph added unexpectedly. I'm grateful for it. Grace looked at him in surprise. This place was dying, Joseph continued, gesturing around them. But with you here, he nodded toward the newly repaired fence line. Maybe we've got a fighting chance. We, Grace repeated softly, caught by the inclusive word. If you're willing, Joseph said, meeting her eyes directly. I know you've no reason to think of this place as yours yet. But if you're willing to invest in it, I'm willing to share the success. He paused. You stay 2 years, work like you have been, and I'll give you a percentage of the profits when we sell the stock. Grace stared at him, momentarily speechless. He was offering her a real stake in the outcome, treating her truly as a partner rather than a hired hand. "Why would you do that?" she asked finally. "Because it's fair," Joseph said again, the phrase seeming to be something of a personal creed for him. "And because I've been alone too long." His gaze drifted to the distant mountains. "It's easier to keep going when you've got someone to build something with." The simple honesty of his words touched Grace deeply. A lifetime of being treated as an oddity, a burden, or at best a curiosity had not prepared her for someone who would value her so straightforwardly. "I'll stay," she heard herself say. "As long as you'll have me, I'll stay and help you make this place what it should be." They shook hands, the calluses on his palm matching her own, workers' hands, strong and capable. In that moment, something shifted between them, a contract evolving into a true partnership. The afternoon found them assessing the barn, where rotting support beams and a sagging loft floor presented their next great challenge. They worked until the light failed, until their muscles screamed for rest. The day's labor had accomplished more than Joseph had managed alone in weeks, and Grace could see the quiet satisfaction in his eyes as they walked back to the house in the gathering dusk. That evening, as they cleaned up after another simple dinner, Joseph gestured around the house. "These next few weeks, while we're doing repairs, I want you to tell me what doesn't work for you here. What's too small, too low, too uncomfortable. We'll fix it. Make this place fit the people living in it." Grace felt tears prick her eyes at the thoughtfulness behind the offer. It was such a practical suggestion, as if caring for her comfort was no different than mending a fence. As if she was worth the effort simply because she was there, a human being with needs and preferences. "Thank you," she managed, her voice rough with emotion, "for all of it, for treating me like a person." "Grace," Joseph replied gently, "that's not something you need to thank me for. That's just basic decency." "You'd be surprised how rare basic decency is," she replied, finally meeting his eyes. Joseph's expression hardened momentarily. "Then the world's full of fools." In the days that followed, they fell into a grueling but satisfying rhythm. Grace rose with the sun, worked alongside Joseph until her body ached with honest fatigue, ate meals that filled her stomach, and fell into bed each night with the deep sleep of the truly exhausted. The ranch was coming back to life under their combined efforts. The barn support beams were replaced one by one, the fence lines secured, and the cattle began to thrive under proper attention. Joseph taught Grace about rotating pastures, about the subtle signs of illness in livestock, about the thousand small details that made the difference between subsistence and prosperity. But it wasn't just the ranch that was changing. 3 weeks after her arrival, Grace found herself laughing, a real, full-bellied laugh that echoed off the barn walls, when a particularly stubborn cow named Matilda managed to step on Joseph's foot, overturn a bucket of feed, and knock down a carefully stacked pile of hay bales in the span of 30 seconds. Joseph had looked at the chaos and said with perfect deadpan delivery, "I see you've met Matilda. She's our resident agent of destruction." And Grace had laughed, the sound startling her. When had she stopped being afraid? When had she stopped waiting for the other shoe to drop, for this new life to reveal its hidden cruelty? 1 month into her employment, the first true test of their partnership arrived on horseback. 3 men rode into the yard as Grace and Joseph were repairing the chicken coop. They were led by a wealthy, well-dressed man whose handsome face was marred by a mean-spirited sneer. Joseph emerged from behind the coop, his body instantly tensing. This was not a friendly visit. "Mercer," the man acknowledged coldly. "Thornton," Joseph replied, his voice equally frosty. "What brings you to my property?" Maxwell Thornton dismounted with practiced elegance, handing the reins to one of his companions. His gaze traveled dismissively over the ranch before settling on Joseph. "Heard you finally broke down and hired help," he remarked. "Couldn't keep this place running on pride alone, could you?" His eyes found Grace standing near the barn entrance, his expression shifting to one of calculating contempt. "That the help? Strange choice. Though I suppose beggars can't be choosers." Joseph stepped forward, his stance protective. "Watch your mouth, Thornton. Grace is my partner. What she is not is any of your business." "Everything in this valley is my business," Thornton replied smoothly, brushing dust from his expensive coat. "I own most of it, including the water rights to that creek of yours." He withdrew a folded paper from his jacket. According to county records, your renewal was due last month, which you missed. Without that renewal, you're using water you have no legal right to. Grace watched the color drain from Joseph's face. Without the creek, the ranch was worthless. The renewal office never sent notice, Joseph said, but his voice lacked conviction. Not my problem, Thornton said with false sympathy, but I'm a reasonable man. I'll reinstate your water rights. All you have to do is sell me this ranch. It was a trap, plain and simple. This wasn't about legal technicalities. It was about a rich man manufacturing a crisis to take what he wanted. How much? Grace heard herself ask, stepping forward. All eyes turned to her. Thornton looked her up and down with undisguised scorn. Excuse me? The renewal, Grace clarified, walking to stand beside Joseph. How much does it cost to renew the water rights? Thornton laughed, a harsh, grating sound. What's it to you, woman? This is between men. I'm a partner in this ranch, Grace said, lifting her chin, which makes it my business. So how much? $50, Thornton admitted reluctantly, but with penalties and late fees, $100 total. Then we'll pay it, Grace said firmly. Today, Joseph can ride into town and follow the renewal. Problem solved. Thornton's face darkened. The deadline has passed. And I'm sure the county clerk will be happy to accept the fee, Grace continued, her voice sweet as honey and twice as dangerous. Unless there's some reason he wouldn't. Some reason the county wouldn't want legitimate fees paid. The implication hung in the air. Corruption. If Thornton had interfered with the notice, it was a crime. Thornton's eyes narrowed dangerously. You're making a mistake, woman. We have each other, Joseph interrupted, finding his voice again. He glanced at Grace with gratitude and respect. Thank you for bringing this to our attention, Thornton. We'll handle it from here. It was a clear dismissal. Thornton mounted his horse, his face flushed with anger. This isn't over, he seethed. One bad winter, one drought, and you'll lose everything. And I'll be there to pick up the pieces for pennies on the dollar. Then I guess we'd better not have any bad luck, Grace replied calmly. After they rode off, Joseph turned to her, his expression a mix of shock and admiration. Where did you learn to face down a man like that? My uncle owed money to half the territory, Grace shrugged. I got used to standing between him and the consequences. She smiled slightly. Besides, he was just a bully in fancy clothes. Joseph's face sobered. But I don't have $100. I do, Grace interrupted. My wages from this month plus what I've saved. It's exactly $100. Grace, no, Joseph protested. That's your money, your future. I can't ask you to. You're not asking, she said firmly. I'm offering. We're partners, remember? If this ranch fails, I lose too. If we save it, we both win. Joseph looked at her for a long moment, struggling with his pride, then finally nodded. Then we ride into town together because you're right, we're partners, and partners don't leave each other to handle the hard parts alone. They rode out within the hour. On the journey, Joseph explained Thornton's ambition to control the entire valley by controlling its water supply. He had been buying up properties for years, sometimes through legitimate means, sometimes through manipulation and threats. They reached town as the sun was setting and went straight to the county clerk's house. The clerk, a nervous man named Peter Simmons, tried to put them off, but the combination of Joseph's unwavering presence and Grace's calm recitation of territorial law regarding emergency filings convinced him to process the paperwork that night. 20 minutes later, they had a receipt. Their ranch was safe, at least for now. As they walked back to their horses, Joseph's hand briefly touched her shoulder. Thank you, he said quietly, for everything. I couldn't have done this without you. Partners, Grace reminded him. That's what we do. Thwarted legally, Maxwell Thornton resorted to brute force. 4 weeks after the confrontation at the county clerk's office, as Grace was repairing tack in the barn, 5 riders entered the yard. They were rough men, armed and confident, and she knew instantly they were trouble. Joseph emerged from the house, his hand moving instinctively toward the revolver at his hip. The lead rider, a man with a scarred face and cold eyes, dismounted with casual arrogance. Mr. Mercer, he called out, tipping his hat in mock courtesy. Name's Garrett. Mr. Thornton sent me with a message. Grace set aside the bridle she'd been mending, and moved silently to the barn doorway, staying in the shadows where she could observe without being immediately noticed. "I don't need messages from Thornton," Joseph replied, his stance alert but controlled. "If he has business with me, he can come himself." Garrett chuckled, a sound devoid of humor. "Oh, he has business all right. Mr. Thornton has a problem. He wants this land, and you keep refusing to sell." The other riders had spread out in a loose semicircle, a subtle but unmistakable threat. "We can solve this easy or hard," Garrett continued, his voice dropping to a menacing drawl. "Easy as you sign the deed and walk away with your life. Hard," he shrugged. "Well, hard involves fire. Accidents happen on ranches all the time. A barn catches fire, stock gets spooked, a stubborn rancher gets trampled." It was a direct threat of murder, delivered with the casual confidence of a man accustomed to intimidation. Before Joseph could respond, Grace stepped out of the barn's shadow. "There's a problem with your plan," she said, her voice carrying across the yard. The men turned, clearly surprised by her appearance. Garrett's eyes narrowed as he took in her unusual height and stature. "You're trespassing," Grace continued, walking forward with deliberate calm, "making terroristic threats and conspiring to commit arson and murder. That's enough to get you hanged in this territory." Garrett recovered quickly, his expression shifting to mocking amusement. "And who's going to stop us, lady? You." "I think," Grace said coldly, positioning herself beside Joseph, "that you were sent here to scare us, not to start a war. Violence leaves evidence, and Mr. Thornton didn't get rich by being stupid." She kept her voice steady, even as her heart pounded with adrenaline. "So I think you'll ride back and tell him we're not scared. We're not selling, and the next person he sends will be met by the sheriff." Garrett stared at her, assessing, calculating. After a tense moment, he remounted his horse. "This isn't over," he warned, but it was clearly a retreat. They rode away, and the moment they were out of sight, Joseph turned to her, his voice tight with controlled fear. "That was either the bravest or most foolish thing I've ever seen. They could have killed us both." "But they didn't," Grace said, feeling the adrenaline fade, leaving her trembling. "They were counting on fear, not resistance." That evening, as they sat before the fireplace in contemplative silence, Grace noticed Joseph rubbing his right leg absently, his face drawn with pain. "Your leg is bothering you," she observed quietly. Joseph looked up, momentarily startled, then offered a rueful smile. "Old war wound, acts up when the weather changes." He glanced toward the window. "Storm coming tomorrow, I'd wager." And Grace hesitated, then asked, "Would you allow me to help? My mother knew remedies for pain. She taught me." Joseph appeared surprised by the offer, but nodded. "I'd be grateful. Nothing I've tried does much good anymore." Grace went to her room and returned with a small cloth bundle from her bag. Unwrapping it, she revealed several packets of dried herbs. "Willow bark for the pain, arnica for the inflammation," she explained, selecting 2 packets. "I'll need to make a poultice and a tea." She worked with quiet efficiency in the kitchen, steeping the willow bark in hot water while preparing a paste of arnica mixed with warm water and a touch of honey. The familiar process reminded her of evenings spent assisting her mother as she tended to neighboring farmers' ailments. When the preparations were ready, Grace returned to find Joseph sitting with his legs stretched out before him, having rolled up his pant leg to reveal an angry scar that ran from knee to mid-calf. "Mini ball at Antietam," he explained simply, seeing her glance. "Shattered the bone. Doctors wanted to amputate, but a field surgeon named Matthews decided to try saving it instead." Grace knelt beside him, applying the arnica poultice with gentle, sure hands. "He did good work," she observed professionally. "The scar is clean." Joseph nodded. "He was a fine doctor, one of the best I ever saw." Something in his tone suggested personal knowledge beyond that of a grateful patient. Grace wrapped the poultice with a clean cloth, then handed him the cup of willow bark tea. "Drink it all," she instructed. "It's bitter, but effective." Joseph grimaced at the first sip but continued drinking dutifully. "Thank you," he said when he'd finished. "Where did you learn such skills?" "My mother," Grace replied, gathering the supplies. "She assisted a nurse during a fever outbreak when I was small. Learned everything she could, then taught me." She paused, considering whether to share more. "I've always been drawn to healing, something about making broken things whole again." Joseph watched her with quiet intensity. You have a gift for it. Your hands are strong but gentle. The unexpected compliment warmed her. Rest now, she said softly. The herbs will work better if you are still. Later that night, a violent thunderstorm broke over the valley, confirming Joseph's weather prediction. Grace lay awake, listening to the rain pounding against the roof, thinking about the confrontation with Thornton's men and the complex man whose home she now shared. Joseph Mercer was becoming a puzzle she couldn't solve, a man of contradictions, tough yet gentle, guarded yet honest, a rancher with the educated speech of someone who had known a different life. Morning brought clear skies and an unspoken agreement between them. They would ride to the next town, Riverdale, to report the threats to Sheriff Davis, putting Thornton's harassment on official record. The journey took most of the day, but Grace found herself enjoying the ride through country she hadn't yet explored. Joseph proved to be knowledgeable about the land, pointing out medicinal plants and telling stories about the area's early settlers. Sheriff Davis, a weathered man with shrewd eyes, listened to their account with growing concern. Thornton's getting bolder, he remarked, making notes in a ledger. Used to be content with financial manipulation. Moving to outright threats is new. You've had other complaints? Joseph asked. Davis nodded grimly. Nothing I could prove in court, but yes, there's been talk. Will you investigate? Grace pressed. The sheriff sighed. I'll make it official, send a deputy out to have a word with Thornton, but without witnesses willing to testify. He let the implication hang. Joseph thanked him, and they turned to leave when Davis called after them. Mercer, be careful. Thornton doesn't like losing. They spent the night at a small inn in Riverdale, taking separate rooms. In the morning, they visited the general store to purchase supplies before heading home. As Grace browsed the shelves, she overheard two women whispering nearby. That's her, the giant woman staying with Mercer. Lord above, she's as big as a man. What do you suppose he keeps her for? Well, it's not proper, whatever it is. A woman that size living alone with a man, there's something unnatural about it. Grace had grown accustomed to such talk, but still, the words stung. She focused on selecting coffee beans, pretending not to hear. A moment later, she felt Joseph's presence beside her. He had clearly overheard as well, for his jaw was tight with anger. Don't give them the satisfaction, he said quietly. Their minds are as small as their hearts. Grace nodded, grateful for his understanding. As they paid for their purchases, the shopkeeper, a kind-faced older man, leaned across the counter. Don't mind the gossips, he said in a low voice. This town's seen too little of the world to appreciate its variety. He smiled warmly at Grace. My late wife was tall as a pine tree and twice as strong. Best years of my life were spent looking up at her face. The unexpected support brought a lump to Grace's throat. Thank you, she managed. Howard Simmons, the man introduced himself. If you folks ever need supplies and don't want to deal with narrow minds, send me a list. My son makes deliveries out your way twice a month. We'll remember that, Joseph said, shaking the man's hand with evident gratitude. The ride home was quiet, both of them lost in thought. The confrontation with Thornton's men and the reminder of society's judgment weighed heavily on Grace's mind. People will always talk, Joseph said suddenly, breaking the silence. About you, about me, about us. They need simple stories to understand a complex world. Grace glanced at him. And what's our story in their eyes? A broken-down rancher and a misfit woman, both damaged goods, he replied frankly. But their story isn't our reality. What is our reality, then? Grace asked softly. Joseph considered this as they crested a hill overlooking the valley, the Mercer Ranch visible in the distance. Two people building something worthwhile from the pieces they have left, he said finally. Isn't that worth more than fitting neatly into someone else's idea of proper? The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm of hard work and growing comfort with each other's presence. The ranch thrived under their combined efforts. Fences were mended, the barn roof repaired, livestock tended with meticulous care. Joseph's knowledge of cattle breeding began to show results as calves were born healthy and strong. Grace's garden flourished, providing fresh vegetables and herbs. They expanded the chicken coop, added 2 milk cows, and repaired the irrigation ditches to the fields. Each evening they would sit on the porch watching the sunset, discussing the day's accomplishments, and planning tomorrow's tasks. Sometimes they spoke of deeper things, memories, hopes, philosophies. Other times they sat in companionable silence, content in each other's presence. Grace learned that Joseph read extensively. His bookshelves held volumes on medicine, history, theology, and literature. He spoke French and some Spanish, and could quote Shakespeare with casual familiarity. These were not the accomplishments of a simple rancher, yet he seemed reluctant to explain their origin. One rainy afternoon, as they sat by the fire mending harnesses, Grace finally asked the question that had lingered in her mind. "You weren't always a rancher, were you?" Joseph's hands stilled momentarily, then resumed their work. "No," he admitted, "not always." "What were you before?" she pressed gently. He was quiet so long that Grace thought he wouldn't answer. Then, without looking up, he said, "A doctor, before and during the war." The revelation, though suspected, still surprised her. "A physician? That explains your knowledge of medicines." "It was another life," Joseph said, his tone indicating reluctance to elaborate. "One I left behind." Grace sensed the pain behind his words and didn't press further. Everyone had the right to their secrets, their private griefs. But the knowledge that Joseph had once been a healer explained much about him: his careful attention to detail, his precise hands, his educated manner. That night, Grace was awakened by sounds from the main room, a cry, followed by muffled words. She rose and moved quietly down the hallway, concerned. Joseph sat before the dying fire, head in his hands, clearly in the grip of some night terror. A half-empty bottle of whiskey stood on the table beside him. "Joseph?" she called softly. He looked up, startled, his eyes momentarily unfocused. Recognition dawned slowly. "Grace, I'm sorry, did I wake you?" "It's all right," she assured him, moving to sit in the chair opposite. "Bad dreams?" He laughed bitterly. "Bad memories, more like." He ran a hand through his disheveled hair. "They visit more often these days." "The war?" she guessed. Joseph nodded, then unexpectedly continued. "I was a surgeon with the 4th Maryland. Saw things no human should see. Did things." He shook his head. "After Antietam, I couldn't save them all. Too many, too fast. Some I had to choose who lived and who died." His voice dropped to a whisper. "I still hear them crying for help." Grace's heart ached for him. "You did what you could." "Not enough," he said sharply, then softened. "Never enough." Silence fell between them, broken only by the occasional pop from the dying embers. After a while, Joseph spoke again, his voice steadier. "Your father was brought in during the 2nd day of fighting. Bayonet wound to the side. Bad but not mortal if treated quickly. I was able to save him when so many others—" He trailed off. We talked while he recovered. He spoke of his wife, his daughter, a girl strong enough to carry water buckets two at a time when she was just 5 years old. Grace's breath caught. "He spoke of me?" Joseph smiled faintly. With such pride, said his Grace had the strength of body and spirit to carry whatever burdens life might place upon her. Tears welled in Grace's eyes at this unexpected glimpse of her father's thoughts. "I didn't know." "Men often speak their hearts more freely to strangers than to those they love most," Joseph observed. "When he was well enough to return to his unit, he promised to visit me after the war, to introduce me to his remarkable family." His expression darkened. But by then, I was no longer the man he'd known. Grace sensed there was more to the story, but Joseph had already revealed more than she'd expected. "Thank you for telling me," she said softly, "for giving me that piece of him." Joseph nodded, reaching for the whiskey bottle again, but stopping himself midway. "I should let you get back to sleep. Tomorrow won't wait for our midnight confessions." Grace hesitated, then rose. "Sometimes speaking the darkness aloud reduces its power over us," she offered. "My mother used to say that." "Your mother sounds like a wise woman," Joseph replied. "I wish I could have known her." "She would have liked you," Grace said with certainty. "Good night, Joseph." "Good night, Grace." The revelation about Joseph's past as a doctor added new layers to Grace's understanding of her employer. No, her partner, she corrected herself. His night terrors continued occasionally, though he never mentioned them directly again. Grace noticed that on particularly bad nights, he would retreat to his room with the whiskey bottle, emerging the next morning hollow-eyed but determinedly functional. One afternoon, while Joseph was in town collecting mail, Grace decided to tend to the small flower garden that had fallen into neglect. It had clearly once been lovingly maintained. Perennials still struggled up through the weeds each year, testament to someone's careful planning. As she cleared away overgrowth, she uncovered a stone marker half buried in the soil. Brushing away the dirt revealed an inscription: Abigail Mercer, beloved wife, 1830-1878. Her hands were gentle, her heart was brave. Grace sat back on her heels, a wave of sadness washing over her. So this had been Abigail's garden, Joseph's wife, buried here among her flowers. The epitaph spoke volumes about the woman she must have been. When Joseph returned and found her still in the garden, now neatly weeded and tended, he stood silently at the edge, his expression unreadable. "I hope you don't mind," Grace said hesitantly. It seemed wrong to let it grow wild. "No," he said after a moment. "She would have appreciated it. Abigail loved her flowers." He approached slowly, kneeling beside the stone marker. "She used to say a garden needs tending, like a soul needs prayer. Regular attention and gentle care." Grace nodded, understanding. "She sounds like she was a remarkable woman." "She was," Joseph agreed, surprising Grace by continuing. "She was a nurse. That's how we met. During the war, she had more natural healing ability in her little finger than most doctors had in their entire bodies." He touched the marker gently. "When I couldn't practice medicine anymore, she understood. Never blamed me, never pushed. Just helped me find a new way to live." His voice thickened. "The fever took her so quickly. 3 days from first symptoms to the end. All my medical knowledge useless." Grace remained silent, honored by his confidence, yet unsure how to comfort such a profound grief. "I've neglected her garden," Joseph admitted. "Couldn't bear to see it, but couldn't bear to destroy it either." "Perhaps," Grace suggested softly, "we could restore it together. As a tribute." Joseph looked up at her, genuine gratitude in his eyes. "I'd like that." From that day forward, they spent a little time each evening in Abigail's garden, clearing, planting, nurturing it back to life. Joseph shared stories of his late wife as they worked, her kindness to patients, her love of poetry, her quiet strength during hard times. Grace listened, asking gentle questions, helping him remember the joy alongside the loss. She understood instinctively that Joseph needed to speak of Abigail, to keep her memory alive while slowly releasing the sharpest edges of his grief. As summer yielded to early autumn, the garden bloomed again with late-season flowers: asters, chrysanthemums, and dahlias in rich purples and golds. The transformation mirrored something happening within the ranch house itself, a gradual softening, a sense of renewal. Grace had begun making small changes to the house: curtains sewn from fabric purchased in Riverdale, wildflowers in mason jars on the table, shelves adjusted to accommodate her height. Joseph encouraged these alterations, seeming pleased to see the home coming back to life under her influence. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching stars emerge in the deepening twilight, Joseph broached a subject they'd both been avoiding. "Winter will be here soon," he observed. "First snow usually comes by late October in these hills." "I've been preparing," Grace assured him. "The root cellar is nearly full, and we've enough preserved meat to last months." Joseph nodded. "It's not the provisions I'm concerned about." He hesitated. "It's the talk. You living here alone with me through the winter. It will give the gossips more fuel." Grace considered this. The rumors had already begun, she knew. Their occasional trips to town had generated whispers, side glances, and outright stares. "Does it trouble you?" she asked. "What people say?" "Not for myself," Joseph replied honestly. "But for you, a young woman with her life ahead of her, reputation matters." "My reputation was hardly pristine before," Grace said with a touch of irony. "The giant spinster, sold at auction by her own family. I doubt winter arrangements could damage it further." Joseph frowned. "You shouldn't speak of yourself that way." "I'm merely acknowledging reality," Grace said. "But to answer your concern, no, I'm not troubled by gossip. Truth is its own defense." "Then you'll stay?" There was something in his voice, a vulnerability she rarely heard. "I said I would," Grace reminded him gently. "I keep my promises." Where relief crossed Joseph's features. "Good, this place needs you." The unspoken implication that perhaps he needed her too hung in the air between them, neither quite ready to acknowledge it directly. The emotional turning point came not from an outside threat, but from a simple accident. One brisk October afternoon, Grace was in the barn loft checking the hay stores before winter fully set in. Joseph worked below, repairing a stall door that had come loose from its hinges. Grace stepped onto a newly repaired plank, not yet fully secured. The wood cracked like thunder beneath her weight, and she plunged through the floor, her hands instinctively shooting out to grab a support beam. She caught it, her body swinging out over the 15-foot drop to the hard-packed dirt below. The strain on her shoulders was immediate and intense. "Grace!" Joseph's voice was sharp with terror. He scrambled up the ladder, his face pale. "Hold on, I'm coming." Her arms burned as she held her full weight, her breath coming in sharp gasps. "The beam won't hold us both," she warned. Joseph ignored her, dropping flat on the loft floor and reaching for her. "I've got you," he called, his hands closing around her wrists like iron bands. Together, they hauled her up and over the edge. She rolled onto the solid planking, her whole body shaking with the aftermath of adrenaline. Joseph gathered her into his arms, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe. "God," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Grace, you could have died." "But I didn't," she said, her own voice unsteady as the reality of the near miss washed over her. When he finally pulled back, she saw raw emotion in his eyes. Fear, relief, and something deeper. Something he'd been carefully guarding. "Grace," he said, his voice rough, "I need you to know you matter to me. Not just as a worker or even a partner. The thought of losing you." He shook his head, unable to complete the thought. "I can't go back to being alone. I won't survive it a second time." Her heart hammered in her chest, torn between hope and caution. This man had become the center of her world, but she'd never dared imagine he might feel the same. "You don't have to say anything," Joseph continued quickly. "I know this is complicated. I know I'm still grieving, still broken in many ways. But you're important. You're important to me." Grace looked at this man who had saved her, respected her, and just pulled her back from a fatal fall. This man who was looking at her as if she were precious beyond measure. "You're important to me too," she said quietly, more than I knew how to say. Joseph leaned forward slowly, giving her every chance to pull away. She didn't. His lips touched hers, a gentle, tentative question. She answered by kissing him back, with a hunger she hadn't known she possessed. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, he rested his forehead against hers. "I'm not going to apologize for that," he said softly. "Don't," she replied simply. The near loss of her, combined with the constant threat from Thornton, stripped away the last of their hesitation. That evening, as they sat by the fire, the air between them charged with unspoken urgency. "Marry me," Joseph said suddenly, the words tumbling out. "I know it's fast, but Grace, marry me, make this official. Make us official." Grace stared at him, wondering if she'd misheard. "Joseph, I love you," he continued, meeting her eyes with unflinching honesty. "I love your strength, your gentleness, your quiet dignity. I love how you face down armed men without flinching and then tend flowers with the same hands. I loved Abigail, and I'll always carry her in my heart. But I love you too, Grace. Differently, but just as truly." Tears streamed down Grace's face. "I love you too," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I never thought anyone would want me, would see me as anything other than a burden or a curiosity. But you look at me like I'm a miracle." "You are," Joseph said simply. "So is that a yes?" "Yes," Grace laughed through her tears. "Yes, I'll marry you." Joseph reached into his pocket and withdrew a simple gold band. "This was my mother's," he explained. "I'd like you to have it, if you're willing." Grace extended her trembling hand, and Joseph slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit as if made for her. "When?" she asked, looking at the ring in wonder. "As soon as possible," Joseph replied. "Before winter sets in fully. We can ride to Riverdale next week. Have Reverend Edwards perform the ceremony." Grace nodded, overwhelmed by joy and a sense of rightness she had never expected to feel. This man, this good, complex, wounded man, had seen her true self and chosen her. Had offered her not just employment or partnership, but a life together as equals. Next week, she agreed, touching the ring that symbolized a future she'd never dared imagine. Later that night, after Joseph had retired to his room, Grace sat alone by the dying fire, her mind trying to absorb the day's dramatic shift. From near death to betrothal in the span of hours, it seemed almost dreamlike in its intensity. Yet underneath the guard lay a shadow of apprehension. Maxwell Thornton's threats remained, and marriage to Joseph would only increase her stake in the outcome of that conflict. And there were other concerns: Joseph's occasional dependence on whiskey to quiet his demons, the war memories that still haunted him, the age difference between them. But as she looked at the ring glinting in the firelight, Grace felt a certainty that transcended these worries. They would face whatever came together, drawing strength from each other's weaknesses, creating something whole from their broken pieces. The following morning brought a fresh urgency to their work. If they were to be married before winter, preparations needed to be made. The house, already improved over recent months, required final touches. The last of the harvest needed gathering, animals tended, supplies secured. Joseph rode into Riverdale to speak with Reverend Edwards and arrange the ceremony. Grace stayed behind, preserving the last of the garden's bounty and taking inventory of winter provisions. As dusk approached with no sign of Joseph, Grace began to worry. The trip should have taken no more than a few hours each way. Even accounting for business in town, he should have returned by now. She was about to saddle a horse and go looking when she heard hoofbeats approaching. Relief flooded through her, only to be replaced by fresh concern when she saw Joseph's condition. He was slumped in the saddle, his face pale, one hand pressed to his side where blood had soaked through his shirt. "Joseph!" she cried, running to help him dismount. "What happened?" "Ambush," he managed through gritted teeth. "Two men on the north trail. Thornton's doing, I'd wager." Grace helped him into the house, her mind already cataloging what she would need: clean water, bandages, her mother's herbs. She eased him onto a chair and quickly cut away his bloodied shirt, revealing a deep gash along his ribs. "Knife," Joseph explained, wincing. "I was lucky. He was aiming for my heart." "Stay still," Grace instructed, her hands already busy preparing what she needed. The wound was serious, but not life-threatening if properly tended. As she worked, Joseph filled in the details. They were waiting around the bend, just past Miller's Creek. Didn't say anything, just attacked. I managed to fight them off, but one got in a lucky strike before I could draw my revolver. "Did you recognize them?" Grace asked, carefully cleaning the wound. Joseph shook his head, wore kerchiefs over their faces. But they were Thornton's men, no doubt, too well dressed for common thieves. Grace nodded grimly as she applied a poultice of yarrow to stop the bleeding. "He's getting desperate." "Or more determined," Joseph countered. "The wedding arrangements must have reached his ears. He knows it will make our partnership more permanent, harder to break." Grace worked in silence for a moment, her hands steady despite her inner turmoil. "This changes things," she said finally. "We need to deal with Thornton before he tries again and succeeds." "Agreed," Joseph said, wincing as she began stitching the wound closed. "But how? Sheriff Davis has been no help, and Thornton's too powerful locally to challenge directly." Grace tied off the last stitch and began bandaging his torso. "We need evidence, something concrete that proves his crimes." "That won't be easy to come by," Joseph pointed out. "Men like Thornton are careful to keep their hands clean." "Everyone makes mistakes," Grace said, her voice hardening with resolve. "And when Thornton makes his, we'll be ready." She helped Joseph to his bedroom, insisting he rest while his body began healing. As she closed his door, Grace felt a cold determination settling over her. Thornton had escalated from threats to violence. The next attempt might succeed where this one had failed. Their wedding would have to wait. First, they needed to ensure they had a future to share. The attack on Joseph marked a turning point in their conflict with the Thornton. What had been a battle over property rights became something more personal, more dangerous. Grace found herself constantly vigilant, watching for signs of trouble while caring for Joseph as he recovered. Despite his protests, Joseph was bedridden for several days. The knife wound, though not fatal, had caused significant blood loss and left him weakened. Grace tended him with the same efficiency she brought to all tasks, changing bandages, preparing nourishing broths, and administering herbal remedies to prevent infection and ease pain. On the third evening, as she brought him dinner, Joseph caught her hand. "You'd have made a fine doctor," he observed. Grace smiled. "Just following what my mother taught me." "It's more than that," Joseph insisted. "You have the instinct for it. The steady hands, the attention to detail, the ability to stay calm in crisis." "Perhaps in another life," Grace said, helping him sit up against the pillows. Joseph's expression turned thoughtful. "Why not this one?" Grace looked at him in surprise. "What do you mean?" "There are medical colleges accepting women now," he said. "Not many, but some. With your intelligence and natural ability—" "Joseph," she interrupted gently, "I'm nearly 24, with no formal education beyond what my parents provided. And we're ranchers in a remote valley, not city folk with connections and resources." He conceded the point with a nod, but added, "Still, you shouldn't limit your thinking about what's possible. The world is changing, even out here on the frontier." The conversation lingered in Grace's mind over the following days. She had never considered formal education a possibility for someone like her, a woman of unusual size and humble origins, destined for practical labor rather than intellectual pursuits. Yet Joseph's suggestion had awakened something, a long dormant dream she'd scarcely acknowledged even to herself. As a child, helping her mother tend neighbors' ailments, she had sometimes imagined herself in a physician's role. The fantasy had seemed so impossible that she tucked it away, focusing instead on more attainable goals. As Joseph regained strength, they resumed discussions about Thornton. The banker's escalation to violence demanded a response, but they remained unsure what action to take. "We need to understand what drives him," Grace reasoned one evening as they sat by the fire. "His obsession with this land seems personal, beyond mere business interest." Joseph nodded slowly. "I've wondered the same. There are more profitable properties he could pursue, yet he fixates on this one." "Is there history between you?" Grace asked. "Something from before my time here?" Joseph hesitated, then sighed. "Nothing direct. I bought this land fair and square from old man Hollister. Thornton made a competing offer but arrived too late. He seemed more irritated than truly angry at the time." "And Abigail? Did she have any connection to him?" A shadow crossed Joseph's face. "Not that I know of. She came from back east, Philadelphia originally. Never mentioned knowing Thornton." They fell silent, the mystery no closer to resolution. The following morning, a cold front swept through the valley, bringing the first snow flurries of the season. As Grace stood on the porch watching white flakes swirl against the gray sky, she heard the distant sound of an approaching horse. The lone rider approached through the swirling snow, a small, bundled figure hunched against the cold. Grace watched warily, her body tense with the readiness that had become second nature since Joseph's attack. "Joseph," she called over her shoulder, "someone's coming." He appeared beside her, revolver in hand, his face set in grim lines. They had learned caution the hard way. But as the rider drew nearer, Grace realized it was a young woman, barely more than a girl, her thin frame shivering visibly even through layers of clothing. The horse she rode was nearly spent, its breath coming in ragged plumes of vapor. "Help!" the girl called, her voice weak against the rising wind. "Please." Before she could finish, she slumped sideways in the saddle. Grace rushed forward, reaching the girl just as she began to fall. With strong arms, Grace caught her, easing her gently to the ground. "She's half frozen," Grace said, noting the girl's blue-tinged lips and ice-crusted clothing. "We need to get her inside." Joseph was already moving, securing the exhausted horse to a hitching post, before helping Grace carry the unconscious girl into the house. They laid her on the sofa before the fireplace, where flames already crackled against the morning chill. Grace worked quickly, removing the girl's wet outer garments while Joseph stoked the fire higher. "She can't be more than 16 or 17, Grace observed, wrapping the girl in warm blankets. "And she's been out in this weather for hours, judging by the state of her clothes." The girl was painfully thin, with delicate features and hair the color of wheat. As Grace examined her for injuries, she found bruises on her wrist and a half-healed cut along her hairline. "Someone's been rough with her," Grace said quietly, anger flickering through her voice. Joseph nodded grimly. "The question is who and why she came here of all places." "She needs warmth and rest," Grace decided. "Questions can wait until she wakes." They worked together with practiced efficiency, Grace brewing herbal tea while Joseph prepared a broth that could be easily swallowed when the girl regained consciousness. They had just finished these preparations when a soft moan came from the sofa. The girl's eyes fluttered open, pale blue filled with immediate fear as she registered unfamiliar surroundings. "It's all right," Grace said gently, kneeling beside her. "You're safe." "I'm Grace Watson, and this is Joseph Mercer. You're at our ranch." The girl tried to sit up, then fell back weakly. "How long have I been here?" "Less than an hour," Joseph replied, keeping his distance to avoid frightening her. "You collapsed when you arrived." Memory seemed to flood back to her. "The storm. I didn't think I would make it." "You almost didn't," Grace said, offering the cup of tea. "Can you drink a little? It will help warm you from within." The girl nodded, accepting Grace's assistance to sit up enough to sip the hot liquid. After a few swallows, color began returning to her face. "What's your name?" Grace asked. "Rebecca," the girl replied. "Rebecca Lawson." "Where are you from, Rebecca? Is there someone we should notify that you're safe?" Fear flashed across her features. "No, please. No one can know I'm here." Her hand instinctively went to her stomach in a protective gesture that Grace immediately recognized. "You're with child," Grace stated quietly, not a question, but a gentle acknowledgement. Tears welled in Rebecca's eyes as she nodded. "3 months along, I think." Joseph and Grace exchanged a glance, understanding passing between them. The situation was clarifying. A young, pregnant girl bearing signs of abuse, fleeing from someone. "You're running from the father?" Joseph asked carefully. Rebecca's expression hardened. "He's no father, he's a monster." "Who is he?" Grace pressed gently. "We need to know if we're to help you." The girl hesitated, then whispered a name that sent a chill through the room despite the blazing fire. "Maxwell Thornton." Joseph's face darkened with fury. "Thornton? Are you certain?" Rebecca nodded miserably. "I was a housemaid in his employ. After his wife died last year, he said I would have certain additional duties." Her voice broke. "When I refused, he threatened to have my father arrested for a debt he could never repay. I had no choice." Grace felt sick with anger, but kept her voice calm for Rebecca's sake. "How did you escape?" "One of the kitchen staff helped me. She gave me money and told me to find the Mercer Ranch." Rebecca looked at Joseph with sudden clarity. "She said you had reason to help anyone fleeing Thornton." Joseph seemed startled by this. "Who was this woman?" "Mrs. Winters. She's been with the Thornton household for years. She said—" Rebecca paused as if trying to recall exact words. "She said to tell you that Abigail would want you to help me." The color drained from Joseph's face. He turned away abruptly, moving to stare out the window at the intensifying snowfall. Grace, sensing his need for privacy, focused on Rebecca. "You need rest and nourishment. We have a spare room prepared where you'll be safe. I'll help you there, and then bring some broth. We can talk more when you're stronger." After settling Rebecca in the small room that had once been Joseph's office, Grace returned to find him still at the window, his expression troubled. "Joseph," she said softly, "what did Rebecca mean? How would Mrs. Winters know Abigail?" He was silent so long that Grace wondered if he'd heard her. Finally he turned, his face haggard with some inner struggle. "There's something I never told you," he said, his voice heavy. "Something about Abigail, about Thornton, about why I left medicine." Grace waited, sensing the importance of whatever confession was coming. "Abigail wasn't just my wife," Joseph began. "She was the finest nurse I ever worked with. After the war, we established a practice in Philadelphia. We were successful, respected. Then came the epidemic of '73. He paused, pouring himself a small measure of whiskey from the bottle kept on the mantel. "We worked ourselves to exhaustion, treating patients. One night I made a mistake, prescribed the wrong dosage for an important patient, the son of a wealthy businessman. The boy nearly died." Joseph drained the whiskey in one swallow. "The father was Maxwell Thornton, newly arrived from New York with ambitions in banking and politics. He threatened to ruin me, to have my license revoked. But he offered an alternative: become his personal physician and provide him with certain medications." "Laudanum," Grace guessed, the pieces falling into place. "Or something stronger." Joseph nodded grimly. "Thornton had developed a dependence during a previous illness. I refused his offer, unwilling to enable his addiction." So he followed through on his threat, fabricated evidence that I'd been treating patients while intoxicated, bribed officials to suspend my license pending investigation. That's why you left medicine, Grace said softly. But what about Abigail? How does she connect to Mrs. Zarsa's Winters? Martha Winters was Abigail's cousin, Joseph explained. When we decided to leave Philadelphia to start fresh out west, Martha helped us. She was already working for Thornton then, though we didn't know the connection until we arrived here and discovered he had followed us, establishing himself as the region's premier banker. He sighed deeply. By then, we'd purchased this land, begun building our home. We hoped Thornton would leave us be, having already taken my career. But he's a man who nurses grudges eternally. And now he wants your land, Grace concluded, to complete his revenge. Yes, Joseph agreed, though I never imagined he would sink to this, he gestured toward Rebecca's room. Abusing a child to satisfy his depraved appetites. Grace's mind was racing, processing this new information. This changes things, she said. Rebecca's testimony, combined with what we already know about his threats and the attack on you, it might be enough to bring him down. If anyone would believe her, Joseph cautioned, a housemaid accusing one of the most powerful men in the territory, against his word alone, she stands little chance. Then we need more, Grace determined. More witnesses, more evidence. That won't be easy to come by, Joseph warned. Perhaps not, Grace acknowledged, but for the first time we have something concrete, and if Thornton has victimized Rebecca, there may be others willing to speak if given the opportunity. Their conversation was interrupted by a soft sound from the doorway. Rebecca stood there, pale but steadier than before. I heard, she said simply, and there are others, at least 3 girls before me that I know of. One of them still works in his kitchen, Mary Collins. She might speak up if she knew she wasn't alone. Grace and Joseph exchanged a meaningful glance. The path forward was becoming clearer, though no less dangerous. You should be resting, Grace said gently to Rebecca. I've rested enough, the girl replied with unexpected firmness. If there's a chance to stop him, to protect other girls, I want to help. Joseph studied her with newfound respect. It would be dangerous. Thornton is not a man who forgives those who stand against him. I know that better than most, Rebecca said, her hand again going protectively to her stomach. But this child deserves a world where men like Maxwell Thornton can't abuse power without consequence. Grace felt a surge of admiration for the young woman's courage. First, you need to regain your strength, she insisted. The storm's worsening, and we're likely to be snowed in for at least a day or two. We'll use that time to plan our next steps carefully. The blizzard that had been threatening all morning descended in full force by midday, confining them to the house. They used the enforced isolation productively, Rebecca sharing everything she knew about Thornton's household, his business dealings, and his vulnerabilities. He keeps a private ledger, she revealed as they sat around the kitchen table that evening. Mrs. Winters once mentioned it contains records of transactions that would ruin him if discovered. What kind of transactions? Joseph asked. I don't know specifics, Rebecca admitted, but she said it involved money that should have gone to the county and deals with landowners who later claimed they'd been cheated. Grace considered this information thoughtfully. So there's documentary evidence of his corruption. If we could obtain that ledger, it's kept locked in his study, Rebecca said. He carries the key with him always. Joseph shook his head. Breaking into Thornton's house would be a fool's errand. We need another approach. They continued discussing possibilities late into the night. By the time they retired, the outlines of a plan had begun to take shape. Risky, dependent on multiple factors beyond their control, but offering a chance of success where none had existed before. The storm raged for 2 days, giving them time to refine their strategy and for Rebecca to regain strength. By the time the skies cleared, revealing a landscape transformed by snow, all 3 were committed to the course of action they'd chosen. I'll ride to Riverdale tomorrow, Joseph announced at breakfast on the 3rd day. We need to speak with Reverend Edwards. His moral authority will be crucial if we're to gather support. And I'll accompany you, Grace added. Rebecca will be safer here alone than traveling in her condition. Rebecca nodded agreement, though her expression betrayed concern. Be careful. If Thornton learns what we're planning, we'll present it as wedding arrangements, Joseph assured her. which is not untrue, merely incomplete. The journey to Riverdale the following day was slow but uneventful, the fresh snow making travel difficult but not impossible. They reached town by mid-afternoon and went directly to the small church where Reverend Edwards maintained both his place of worship and his modest home. The minister, a thoughtful man in his 60s with kind eyes and a reputation for principled stands on moral issues, listened without interruption as they related Rebecca's story and the broader pattern of Thornton's abuses. "These are grave accusations," he said when they finished. "If true, and I have no reason to doubt your word, they demand action. But proving such things against a man of Thornton's standing will be challenging. Which is why we need your help," Grace explained. "Your moral authority in the community is beyond question. If you were to speak with potential witnesses, they might find courage they would otherwise lack." Edwards considered this, stroking his gray beard thoughtfully. "I cannot directly involve the church in what might appear to be a personal vendetta. However," he added, seeing their faces fall, "I can certainly minister to those who may have suffered abuse and encourage them to seek justice through proper channels." "That's all we ask," Joseph assured him, "along with your discretion until we're ready to act." The minister nodded. "Of course. When do you propose to begin this ministry?" "As soon as possible," Grace replied, "but carefully, one potential witness at a time, starting with Mary Collins at the Thornton household." "I know Mary's family," Edward said. "Her father is a deacon in our congregation. I can arrange to visit them on pastoral business without raising suspicion." With this tentative alliance secured, they continued to Howard Simmons's general store, where they had found unexpected support during their previous visit. The shopkeeper welcomed them warmly, then grew serious when they asked for a private word. In the back room of his store, surrounded by crates of merchandise, they shared a carefully edited version of their situation, omitting Rebecca's presence at the ranch, but explaining their need for allies against Thornton's intimidation. "I've heard rumors about Thornton for years," Simmons admitted. "Never anything substantial enough to act on, but enough to make me wary of doing business with him." He leaned forward conspiratorially. "What do you need from me?" "Information, primarily," Joseph explained. "You hear things in your position. Gossip, complaints, patterns that might not be obvious to outsiders." Simmons nodded thoughtfully. "I do indeed, and I'd be willing to share what I know. Thornton's business practices have driven more than one small merchant to ruin." He paused, then added, "My son Peter works at the county clerk's office. If there are official records that might be relevant, he could help locate them." This was more than they had hoped for. By the time they left the store, they had gained not only Simmons's support, but his promise to arrange a discreet meeting with his son the following day. Their final stop was Sheriff Davis's office. They found him at his desk, reviewing wanted posters with the weary expression of a man who had seen too much of human frailty. "Mercer, Miss Watson," he greeted them. "What brings you to town in this weather?" "Wedding plans," Joseph replied smoothly, "and a follow-up about the attack last month." Davis sighed. "I sent a deputy to question Thornton, as promised. He denied any involvement, of course, and without witnesses." "We understand," Grace said, "but we've come across some information that might interest you regarding Mr. Thornton's other activities." The sheriff's expression turned wary. "What kind of activities?" Joseph glanced around the empty office, then lowered his voice. "The kind that might involve misappropriation of county funds." Davis' eyes narrowed. Davis's eyes. "That's a serious accusation. What evidence do you have?" "Nothing concrete yet," Joseph admitted, "but we're developing sources. If we find something substantive, would you be willing to investigate, regardless of who's involved?" The sheriff studied them both for a long moment. "I took an oath to uphold the law, Mr. Mercer. If you bring me actual evidence of wrongdoing, I'll do my duty, but I won't participate in a witch hunt based on personal grievances." It wasn't the enthusiastic support they might have wished for, but it was something, a commitment to act if provided with sufficient cause. They spent the night at Riverdale's small inn, sharing a room for propriety's sake, now that their engagement was known. As they prepared for sleep, Grace noticed Joseph's troubled expression. "What is it?" she asked softly. "I'm worried about Rebecca," he confessed, "leaving her alone, even for a night. The ranch is remote, and the snow makes travel difficult." Grace reassured him. "She has your revolver and knows how to use it, and Thornton believes she's fled much farther. He has no reason to search our property. Joseph nodded, though his concern remained evident. It's not just that. This plan we're developing, it places her at tremendous risk. All of us, really, but especially her. If Thornton realizes she's testified against him, she understands the danger, Grace said gently, but living in fear is its own kind of prison. She's chosen to fight for herself and her child. I know, Joseph sighed. I just hope we can protect her when the time comes. They met with Peter Simmons early the next morning in a private room at the inn. The young clerk was nervous but determined, his father's sense of justice evidently inherited. I've seen irregularities in the water rights records, he confided after assurances of discretion. Properties foreclosed upon by Thornton's bank often show water rights transfers filed days or weeks before the actual foreclosure proceedings begin. As if he knew in advance which properties would default, Joseph observed. Peter nodded. Exactly. And there are discrepancies in tax payments as well. Amounts recorded in the official ledger that don't match the receipt copies I've glimpsed. Could you obtain copies of these records? Grace asked. The clerk hesitated. It would be risky. Thornton has the county recorder in his pocket, but he considered for a moment. I could create a legitimate reason to review the files, perhaps an audit of water rights following last year's drought. It might allow me to make copies without raising suspicion. That would be extremely helpful, Joseph encouraged. But don't take unnecessary risks. If it seems too dangerous, withdraw. They left Riverdale by mid-morning. Their network of potential allies expanded, but their anxiety for Rebecca growing with each hour of separation. The return journey passed in tense silence, both scanning the trail ahead for signs of trouble. As they crested the final hill overlooking the ranch, Grace felt her heart stop. A thin column of smoke rose from behind the house, not the normal smoke of a chimney, but the darker smudge of something burning that shouldn't be. Joseph spurred his horse forward without a word, Grace close behind. They thundered down the slope, fear giving their mounts fresh energy despite the difficult terrain. They rounded the house to find the small woodshed ablaze, flames licking at the winter sky. Of Rebecca, there was no immediate sign. "Rebecca!" Grace shouted, leaping from her horse before it had fully stopped. A movement at the corner of the house caught her attention. Rebecca emerged, Joseph's revolver gripped in her shaking hands, her face smudged with soot but determination burning in her eyes. "They came," she said simply. "3 men. I hid in the cellar when I heard them. They thought the house was empty." "Are you hurt?" Grace demanded, quickly examining the girl for injuries. Rebecca shook her head. "When they started the fire, I knew I had to do something. I fired a warning shot from the cellar door. They ran off toward the east ridge." Joseph was already moving toward the burning shed, assessing the danger to the main house. "We need to contain this before it spreads. Grace, the water buckets from the well." They worked frantically, forming a chain to douse the flames. The winter snow proved a blessing, providing additional moisture to combat the fire. After 20 minutes of desperate effort, the blaze was reduced to smoldering embers, the shed itself a loss, but the threat to the house neutralized. "They left this," Rebecca said when they had finished, holding out a crudely lettered note that had been nailed to the barn door. "I found it after they fled." Joseph took it, reading aloud. "Next time, it's the house with you in it. Sell or burn." His face hardened with cold fury. Thornton's getting desperate. He knows we were in town, probably assumes we're gathering support against him. "We need to accelerate our plan," Grace decided, leading them both back to the house. "If he's willing to commit arson now, he'll only grow more dangerous as he feels cornered." Inside, they compared observations from their time in Riverdale with Rebecca's description of the attackers. One detail caught Grace's attention immediately. "You say one of them wore a deputy's badge?" she asked, frowning. Rebecca nodded. "Partially hidden by his coat, but I saw it flash when he turned." Joseph and Grace exchanged troubled glances. "Davis," Joseph said grimly. "He must have informed Thornton of our questions immediately after we left his office. Or he was already in Thornton's pocket," Grace suggested. "Either way, we can't rely on local law enforcement." This complication demanded a reassessment of their strategy. If the sheriff couldn't be trusted, they would need to seek justice through other channels. The circuit judge, Joseph proposed. Judge Harmon has a reputation for incorruptibility. He's due in Riverdale next month for the winter sessions. That's too long to wait, Grace objected. Thornton will move against us again before then. We could take Rebecca to safety in the meantime, Joseph suggested. Perhaps to Denver, where Thornton has less influence. Rebecca spoke up firmly. I'm not running anymore. If I leave, we lose our strongest witness against him. And I won't abandon you both after all you've risked for me. The girl's courage was humbling. Grace nodded her agreement. Then we stay together and accelerate our timeline. Reverend Edwards was to speak with Mary Collins tomorrow. If she corroborates Rebecca's account, we'll have multiple witnesses to Thornton's abuse. And Peter Simmons may have secured documents showing financial improprieties by then, Joseph added. Which leaves the question of where to bring these charges, if not to Sheriff Davis, Grace mused. They debated options late into the night, weighing risks and potential outcomes. By morning, they had settled on a daring but feasible approach. They would compile their evidence and present it not only to Judge Harmon, but to the territorial newspaper editor in Riverdale. Public exposure is what Thornton fears most, Joseph reasoned. His power derives from his reputation as a respectable businessman. If that's damaged, much of his influence evaporates. The next week passed in a flurry of careful preparation and growing tension. Reverend Edwards sent word through Howard Simmons that Mary Collins had confirmed Rebecca's account and was willing to provide a sworn statement. Peter Simmons delivered copies of county records showing disturbing patterns in Thornton's financial dealings. Grace, Joseph, and Rebecca remained vigilant, taking turns standing watch through the nights. They reinforced doors and windows, prepared escape routes, and kept horses saddled for quick departure if needed. Winter deepened around them, fresh snow falling every few days, creating a deceptive blanket of tranquility over the tense landscape of their lives. Christmas approached, though none of them felt much inclination to celebrate. Then, on the morning of December 23rd, an unexpected visitor arrived. Martha Winters, bundled against the cold, drove a small sleigh up to the ranch house just as dawn was breaking. Joseph met her on the porch, rifle in hand, until he recognized her. "Martha, what are you doing here?" The woman, gray-haired, dignified despite her simple clothes, stepped carefully from the sleigh. "I've come with news and a warning, Joseph. May I come inside?" Grace helped her into the house, where Rebecca waited with barely contained emotion. Mrs. Winters embraced the girl warmly before turning to address them all. "Thornton knows what you're doing," she said without preamble. "One of the minister's deacons is in his debt and reported your inquiries. He's planning to have all three of you arrested on false charges, theft, I believe, of county property." Joseph's expression darkened. "When?" "Tomorrow," Mrs. Winters replied. "He's already spoken with Sheriff Davis. They'll come at dawn with a warrant." This acceleration demanded immediate response. Their carefully laid plans would have to be abandoned for more direct action. "We need to leave tonight," Joseph decided. "Take our evidence directly to the newspaper editor, Charles Hollister. If we can get the story printed before Thornton realizes we've fled, he'll still come after us," Grace pointed out. "But at least the truth will be public record, harder to suppress." Mrs. Winters nodded in agreement. "I believe that's your best option. But you should know, Thornton has men watching the roads to Riverdale. You'll need an alternative route." Joseph moved to the cabinet where he kept maps of the surrounding territory. "There's an old mining trail that cuts through Blackwater Canyon," he said, tracing the path with his finger. "Difficult terrain, especially in winter, but it would bring us to Riverdale from the north, avoiding the main roads." "It's risky," Grace acknowledged, "but less dangerous than waiting to be arrested on fabricated charges." They spent the day in hurried preparation. Essential supplies were packed, documents secured, horses fed and rested for the difficult journey ahead. Mrs. Winters departed before noon, returning to the Thornton household where her absence might soon be noted. As dusk approached, they gathered in the kitchen for a final meal before departure. The atmosphere was solemn yet determined, each lost in private thoughts about the dangerous path they had chosen. Grace found herself studying Joseph's face in the lamplight, memorizing each line and playing as if against some future loss. He caught her gaze and reached across the table to take her hand. "We'll get through this," he promised quietly, "and when it's over, we'll have that wedding we planned." "In the spring," Grace agreed, squeezing his fingers, "when the wildflowers bloom in Abigail's garden." Rebecca, watching them with a sad smile, placed her hand protectively over her growing belly. I hope my child knows such love someday. The moment of connection was interrupted by a sound that froze them all. The distant but unmistakable report of a rifle, followed by the clatter of approaching horses. Joseph was on his feet instantly, moving to the window. Riders coming fast, at least 6 of them, armed. Thornton's men, Grace concluded, already reaching for her coat. He must have moved up his timeline. Or Mrs. Winters was discovered, Rebecca suggested fearfully. There was no time for speculation. Joseph grabbed the packet of evidence they'd compiled, thrusting it into his coat. We need to leave now, through the back. The horses are ready in the barn. They moved swiftly, Grace leading Rebecca while Joseph gathered the last essential items. They slipped out the back door into the cold night air, keeping to the shadows as they hurried toward the barn. They were halfway there when the first riders burst into the yard, lanterns held high to illuminate the darkened property. Among them, clearly visible in the lead, was Maxwell Thornton himself, his aristocratic features contorted with rage. Check the house, he ordered. Find the girl and bring her to me. The others are expendable. Joseph pulled Grace and Rebecca behind a woodpile, out of the immediate line of sight. The barn's too exposed now, he whispered. We need another way out. Grace's mind raced, considering options. The creek bed, she decided. It's dry this time of year, and it runs all the way to the eastern ridge. If we can reach it unseen. A shout from the house indicated their absence had been discovered. Lanterns began sweeping the yard in widening arcs. Go, Joseph urged, pressing the evidence packet into Grace's hands. Take Rebecca and follow the creek bed. I'll create a diversion to draw them away. No, Grace protested. We stay together. There's no time to argue, Joseph insisted. This evidence must reach Hollister, and Rebecca needs protection. You're stronger, faster. You have the best chance of getting through. Before she could object further, he kissed her swiftly, then turned to Rebecca. Trust Grace. She'll keep you safe. With that, he was gone, slipping toward the far side of the yard where the horses were kept. Moments later, they heard a crash, followed by shouts as Joseph deliberately drew attention to himself. Let's go, Grace whispered to Rebecca, heartbreaking at the thought of leaving Joseph behind, but knowing he was right about their priorities. They moved silently along the edge of the property until they reached the dried creek bed that cut across the eastern pasture. The snow-filled gully provided perfect cover as they made their way eastward, the sounds of pursuit growing fainter behind them. They had traveled perhaps half a mile when a single gunshot echoed across the valley, followed by triumphant shouts. Grace faltered, a sob rising in her throat, but Rebecca gripped her arm fiercely. We have to keep going, she insisted, for Joseph, for all of us. Drawing on reserves of strength and determination she hadn't known she possessed, Grace continued forward, helping Rebecca navigate the difficult terrain. The full moon provided enough light to follow the creek bed as it wound through the winter landscape toward the distant ridge. Behind them, lights began moving in their direction. Their tracks in the snow would be easy to follow, even at night. They needed to reach the forested slopes ahead before Thornton's men caught up. Can you go faster? Grace asked Rebecca, anxiety making her voice tense. The girl nodded grimly, pushing herself harder despite her condition. They reached the first stands of pine trees as the sounds of pursuit grew louder. Men on horseback moving rapidly along their trail. Up there, Grace pointed to a dense thicket of trees on a rocky outcropping. If we can reach those rocks, we can lose them in the forest beyond. The climb was arduous. It can say any made more difficult by the snow and Rebecca's pregnancy. Grace practically carried the girl the last 50 yards, her extraordinary strength proving vital as they scrambled up the steep incline. They reached the thicket just as the first riders appeared at the base of the slope. Crouching low among the trees, they watched as Thornton himself directed the search, his face illuminated by lantern light. Find them, he shouted, his cultured voice cracking with rage. The girl must be recaptured, alive and unharmed. The other one, he paused meaningfully. Accidents happen in these mountains. The men spread out, beginning to comb the slope. Grace and Rebecca retreated deeper into the forest, moving as quietly as possible across the snow-covered ground. The darkness beneath the pines worked in their favor, making it difficult for the searchers to follow their trail. For hours they continued their desperate flight, the sounds of pursuit sometimes fading, sometimes drawing nearer as the hunters crisscrossed the mountainside. Rebecca's strength was flagging, her breathing labored, but she pressed on with determination born of desperation. Dawn found them high on the ridge, looking down toward Riverdale in the valley beyond. They had temporarily evaded Thornton's men, but their situation remained precarious. The direct route down to the town would leave them exposed on open slopes with nowhere to hide. We need to follow the ridge line north, Grace decided, studying the terrain. There's a steeper path down through Blackwater Canyon, but it's sheltered by trees the whole way. Rebecca nodded, too exhausted for words. Her face was pale with fatigue, dark circles beneath her eyes testifying to the ordeal's toll on her already weakened body. Grace felt a surge of protective determination. This brave girl had risked everything to escape Thornton's abuse, to give her unborn child a chance at a better life. Joseph had sacrificed himself to ensure their escape. She would not fail them now. Just a little further, she encouraged, helping Rebecca to her feet. We'll rest properly once we reach the canyon. They had covered perhaps another mile along the ridge when they heard it, the distant baying of hounds. Thornton had brought in tracking dogs. We need to move faster, Grace urged, fear giving her voice an edge. Once those dogs pick up our scent. They pushed on, their pace hampered by exhaustion in the increasingly rocky terrain. The dogs' baying grew steadily louder, indicating the pursuit was gaining ground. When they finally reached the head of Blackwater Canyon, Grace made a difficult decision. The narrow trail that descended through the gorge was treacherous in the best conditions. In winter, with an exhausted pregnant girl, it was potentially deadly. But remaining on the ridge meant certain capture. We have no choice, she told Rebecca. We have to try the canyon trail. The girl nodded her understanding, her face set with grim resolve despite her exhaustion. Lead the way, I'll follow. The descent began well enough, the trail switchbacking down the steep canyon wall, sheltered by dense pine forest. Grace led the way, helping Rebecca navigate the more difficult sections, both of them alert for sounds of pursuit. They were perhaps halfway down when disaster struck. A section of trail, weakened by winter ice, crumbled beneath Rebecca's feet. She slipped with a startled cry, tumbling several feet down the slope before Grace could catch her. Rebecca! Grace scrambled down to where the girl had landed, heart pounding with fear. Rebecca lay curled on her side, arms wrapped protectively around her midsection, her face contorted with pain. The baby, she gasped. Something's wrong. Grace helped her to a more comfortable position, quickly examining her for injuries. There was no blood, which was promising, but Rebecca's obvious pain suggested the fall might have triggered early labor, or worse. Can you stand? Grace asked gently. Rebecca tried, but collapsed back with a moan of pain. I can't, she whispered, tears streaming down her face. You have to go on without me. Get the evidence to Hollister. I'm not leaving you, Grace said firmly. You must, Rebecca insisted. If Thornton captures us both, everything we've done, everything Joseph sacrificed, will be for nothing. The girl was right, Grace knew. The evidence they carried was their only hope of bringing Thornton to justice. But abandoning Rebecca to save herself was unthinkable. As she wrestled with this impossible choice, the baying of the hounds grew suddenly louder. The dogs had reached the canyon rim and would soon be on the trail. Grace made her decision. I'll build you a shelter, she said, gathering fallen branches from nearby. Something to keep you warm and hidden. Once I've delivered the evidence, I'll bring help back for you. Working quickly, she constructed a crude lean-to against a rocky outcropping, partially concealed by pine boughs. She helped Rebecca inside, covering her with the extra coat she'd carried in her pack. Take this, Grace said, pressing Joseph's revolver into Rebecca's hand. There are 5 shots left. Use them only if you have no choice. Rebecca clutched the weapon, her eyes wide with fear, but determined. Go quickly, she urged. And Grace, thank you for everything. With a last reassuring squeeze of the girl's hand, Grace continued down the canyon, moving as fast as she dared on the treacherous trail. The evidence packet was secure inside her coat, pressed against her heart like a talisman. She reached the canyon floor as the winter sun climbed toward noon, casting long shadows through the gorge. Riverdale lay just 2 miles ahead across open country, tantalizingly close yet still dangerously exposed. The baying of the hounds had faded, suggesting the dogs might have lost the scent in the rocky terrain of the canyon. But Grace took no chances, keeping to the tree line as she made her way toward town. As she approached Riverdale's outskirts, she slowed her pace, conscious of her unusual appearance. A tall, disheveled woman emerging from the wilderness, likely to attract unwanted attention. She needed to reach Hollister without being intercepted by any of Thornton's allies. Fortune favored her. Charles Hollister's newspaper office sat on the edge of town, its windows still lit despite the early hour. Grace approached cautiously, circling to the back entrance rather than risking the main street. She knocked urgently on the rear door, praying that Hollister himself would answer, rather than some junior employee who might turn her away. The door opened to reveal a middle-aged man with ink-stained fingers and spectacles perched on his nose. "Yes?" he asked, clearly surprised to find a visitor at the back entrance. "Mr. Hollister?" Grace confirmed. "I'm Grace Watson from the Mercer Ranch. I have evidence of criminal activity by Maxwell Thornton that requires immediate attention." Hollister's eyebrows rose, but he stepped aside to allow her entry. "I've heard rumors," he admitted, leading her to a cluttered office. "But accusations against a man of Thornton's standing require substantial proof." "We have it," Grace said, withdrawing the packet from inside her coat. "Financial records showing embezzlement of county funds, sworn statements from multiple women he's abused, documentation of violent intimidation against landowners who refused to sell to him." Hollister opened the packet, skimming its contents with growing astonishment. "This is extraordinary," he murmured. "If verified, these allegations would destroy Thornton completely." "They can be verified," Grace assured him. "Peter Simmons at the county clerk's office can confirm the financial discrepancies. Mary Collins and Rebecca Lawson will testify to his abuses, and Joseph Mercer," her voice faltered momentarily, "can attest to the threats and violence." "Where is Mercer?" Hollister asked, glancing up from the documents. Grace fought back tears. "Captured, possibly killed, while helping us escape. And Rebecca is injured in Blackwater Canyon, hiding from Thornton's men. She needs immediate help." Hollister's expression turned grave. "This goes beyond newspaper reporting. We need legal authorities involved." "Sheriff Davis is complicit," Grace warned. "He's been helping Thornton cover his crimes." The editor nodded thoughtfully. "Then we go above him. Judge Harmon arrived yesterday for the winter sessions, a man of impeccable integrity, from all accounts." "Will you help us?" Grace pressed. Hollister squared his shoulders. "Miss Watson, taking on Maxwell Thornton may be professional suicide for my newspaper, but some stories must be told, regardless of consequences. Wait here while I summon Judge Harmon." True to his word, within an hour Hollister returned with Judge Harmon, a tall, austere man with piercing eyes and a reputation for absolute fairness. The judge reviewed the evidence with methodical thoroughness, asking pointed questions that Grace answered as completely as she could. When he had finished, he looked up with cold determination. "These charges warrant immediate action," he declared. "I'll issue warrants for Thornton's arrest and send telegrams to the territorial governor, requesting federal marshals, as the local sheriff appears compromised." "Rebecca needs help now," Grace reminded them urgently. "She's injured, alone, possibly in labor." "I'll organize a rescue party," Hollister volunteered. "There are men in town I trust implicitly who won't be intimidated by Thornton's influence." Events moved swiftly after that. Judge Harmon drafted arrest warrants while Hollister assembled a group of armed volunteers. Grace provided detailed directions to Rebecca's hiding place, desperately wanting to join the rescue party, but recognizing that her exhausted condition would only slow them down. As preparations continued, a commotion erupted outside the newspaper office. Shouts and the thunder of approaching horses drew them all to the windows. In the street below, a remarkable scene was unfolding. Joseph Mercer, bloodied but very much alive, rode at the head of a group of horsemen. Beside him, to Grace's astonishment, was Sheriff Davis, looking grim and somewhat ashamed. And bound securely to his saddle, Maxwell Thornton himself sat rigid with fury, his aristocratic features contorted in a mask of thwarted rage. Grace burst through the door and down the steps, launching herself into Joseph's arms as he dismounted. "I thought you were dead," she sobbed against his chest. "We heard gunshots." "A warning shot that went wild," Joseph explained, holding her tightly despite his obvious injuries. "They captured me, but not before I managed to convince Sheriff Davis to question why Thornton was so desperate to recover a thieving servant girl that he'd resort to armed pursuit in the middle of the night." Sheriff Davis stepped forward, his expression a mixture of regret and determination. "Thornton overplayed his hand," he explained. "When he ordered his men to shoot Mercer, despite my direct instruction not to, I realized I'd been backing the wrong man." He glanced at Thornton with distaste. "When we searched his saddlebags, we found this." He held up a small leather-bound book that Grace recognized from Rebecca's description, the private ledger containing records of Thornton's illicit transactions. "Rebecca," Grace remembered suddenly. "She's injured in the canyon." "Already attended to," Joseph assured her. "We found her on our way here. Dr. Williams is with her now at his surgery. She's shaken and exhausted, but both she and the baby appear to be stable." Relief washed through Grace in a dizzying wave. Against all odds, they had succeeded. Thornton was captured, Rebecca was safe, and Joseph, dear, brave Joseph, had survived. Judge Harmon approached, arrest warrants in hand. "Sheriff Davis, I'm formally charging Maxwell Thornton with embezzlement of county funds, assault, attempted murder, and moral crimes against young women under his employ. He is to be held without bail pending a full investigation." Thornton, who had maintained rigid silence until now, finally spoke, his voice dripping with contempt. "You'll regret this, all of you. My associates in the territorial capital will distance themselves quickly once these charges become public." Hollister interrupted, holding up the evidence packet. "Tomorrow's edition of the Riverdale Chronicle will ensure that happens with remarkable speed." As Thornton was led away to the jail, Grace turned back to Joseph, examining his injuries more carefully. A gash across his forehead had been hastily bandaged, and he held himself stiffly, suggesting bruised or broken ribs. "You need a doctor," she insisted. "Later," Joseph said, his eyes never leaving her face. "First, there's something I need to do." To Grace's astonishment, he lowered himself carefully to one knee before her, taking her hand in his. "I promised you a spring wedding," he said softly, "but I've learned that life is too uncertain to delay happiness. Grace Watson, will you marry me today, right now, with these good people as witnesses?" Grace looked around at the gathered crowd, Hollister smiling broadly, Judge Harmon with unexpected warmth in his usually stern eyes, the volunteers who had been prepared to risk their lives to rescue Rebecca. These strangers had become allies in their darkest hour, embodiments of the justice and decency they had fought to defend. "Yes," she answered, tears of joy replacing those of fear and grief. "Today and every day for the rest of our lives." Judge Harmon stepped forward. "As it happens, performing marriages falls within my judicial duties. If you're serious about this—" "Never more serious about anything," Joseph affirmed, rising to stand beside Grace. And so, on the steps of the Riverdale Chronicle, with the winter sun shining down on snow-covered streets, Grace Watson and Joseph Mercer spoke their vows. It wasn't the spring wedding they had planned, with wildflowers in Abigail's garden. It was something different, perhaps even better, a testament to survival, to justice prevailed, to love that had grown strong in the face of adversity. "By the authority vested in me," Judge Harmon concluded, "I now pronounce you husband and wife." As Joseph's lips met hers, Grace felt a profound sense of rightness settle over her. The journey had been arduous, the dangers real, but they had emerged victorious, not just over Thornton, but over the limitations others had tried to place upon them. She was Grace Mercer now, and the strength that had once made her an outcast had become the very thing that saved them all. 3 months later, as the first green shoots pushed through the soil of Abigail's garden, Grace sat on the porch of the Mercer Ranch, watching Joseph work with the spring calves in the near pasture. Rebecca, her newborn daughter sleeping peacefully in her arms, sat beside her, her face serene in the soft spring sunlight. "I've decided to name her Hope," Rebecca announced, gently stroking the infant's downy head, "because that's what you and Joseph gave me when I had none. Grace smiled, deeply touched. It's perfect. And what about your plans? Have you decided? Rebecca nodded. I'm accepting Reverend Edwards' offer. The position at the church orphanage will provide for us both, and the teaching duties will allow me to use my education. She glanced at the baby, and Hope will grow up surrounded by other children, never knowing loneliness. The aftermath of Thornton's arrest had brought sweeping changes to the region. His financial empire, built on corruption and intimidation, had crumbled under investigation. Properties he had seized illegally were being returned to their rightful owners. The county government, purged of his influence, operated with new transparency. For the Mercers, life had settled into a rhythm of hard work and quiet joy. The ranch thrived under their combined care, becoming a model of successful operation that other farms sought to emulate. Joseph's nightmares came less frequently now, the healing power of purpose and love gradually easing the war's lingering trauma. And Grace, who had once been seen as too much, too strong, too different, found herself increasingly called upon by neighbors seeking her counsel, her strength, her wisdom. The very qualities that had made her an outcast now made her a valued member of the community. You know, Joseph remarked that evening as they sat before the fire, his arm around her shoulders, your father was right about you. How so? Grace asked, leaning into his embrace. He told me you had the strength to carry whatever burdens life placed upon you, Joseph reminded her. But what neither of us understood then was that your greatest strength isn't in your body, remarkable as it is. It's in your heart, your spirit, your unshakable sense of justice and compassion. Grace considered this, warmth spreading through her at the memory of her father's faith in her. Perhaps that's true, she acknowledged, but I've learned that strength alone isn't enough. It needs purpose to guide it, wisdom to temper it, and love to fulfill it, Joseph added softly, kissing her forehead. And love to fulfill it, Grace agreed, turning her face to meet his lips with hers. Outside, the spring wind carried the scent of new growth and possibility across the valley. Inside, the fire cast golden light over two people who had found in each other not just partnership or passion, but true completion. The strength of Grace and the healing touch of Joseph, bound together in a love that had overcome every obstacle placed in its path.